Today I'm coming at you with another restoration project. A couple of years ago, I sold this pair of Jordan Spizikes to a good friend of mine, and it was his very first pair of Jordans ever. As you can tell, he wore these things into the ground. At this point in time, this pair of kicks is suffering from severe sole separation from both the midsole to the upper, as well as the outsole to the midsole. Additionally, the midsole has some serious paint cracking, and the uppers are incredibly scuffed up and dirty. He asked me to work my magic as best as I could to try and bring these things back from the dead, so that's exactly what I'm going to be doing today. We need to first separate the midsoles from the uppers and the outsoles from the midsoles, so let's get into it. In order to disconnect the outsoles from the uppers, you actually have to pull out the stitching at the toe cap. In order to do this, I use a Cricut weeding tool and a razor blade. I cut a couple of times and then pull out the remaining stitching. Because of how old the glue was on this pair of kicks, it was very easy to pull away the uppers from the midsole using only the pressure of my hands and a bone folder. I was able to separate the outsoles from the midsoles using nothing but my hands. Now that I have the outsoles separated from the midsoles and the midsoles separated from the uppers, it's time for me to strip the paint from the midsoles. Because of how old these midsoles are and the fact that they're actually cracking and crumbling ever so slightly, I'm trying to preserve the integrity to at least give these shoes a little bit more longevity. So what I'm doing is actually using a clay molding tool. While it is a very long and tedious process, it's definitely one of the safest ways to remove this style of paint. But unfortunately, due to how old and brittle they are, they definitely took some damage along the process. I gotta prep all of my surfaces by removing the old excess glue. So let's get down to that part now. I started my glue removal by working on the outsole. I began utilizing a Dremel tool with a grinding bit to try and get off as much glue as possible, and followed that up with some acetone and cotton balls to remove any remaining debris. I then moved to the uppers, where I started with a precision grinding Dremel bit to try and get off as much of the old glue as possible. I switched over to a sanding bit when I got to some of the different materials in order to try and roughen up the surfaces, and then I finished off using a tiny bit of acetone on some cotton balls to get rid of the remaining debris. I then moved to the midsoles. The midsoles were especially delicate due to age, so I had to use very light pressure with my Dremel, and I only used a tiny bit of acetone to clean up any sort of remaining debris. Now that the prep work has been done on these Jordan Spizikes, it's time to get them re-glued. First, I'll be attaching the outsole to the midsole, and then we'll be attaching the midsole to the upper. I began my re-gluing process by doing the midsole to the upper, so then I could provide some support to the really brittle midsoles. After applying 2 thin coats of Barge Super Stick cement, I let it cure for 2 hours before applying some heat and getting my surfaces bonded. I started by bonding the heels where I figured the lines were the most obvious, and then I aligned the toe. After that, the lateral and medial side basically fell into place, and I was able to apply my heat, reactivate the glue, and get a nice firm bond between the midsole and the outsole. I then moved to the upper to midsole bond, where I followed essentially the same exact process. The only difference for this is that on the uppers I utilized a finer tipped brush, so I was able to be more precise with my work. Again, I let the glue cure for about 2 hours before reheating it with my heat gun, and this time beginning my bonding process at the toe. I like doing the toe first for the upper to midsole reglue because I have a really good idea of how the toe cap should fit in from the upper to the outsole. From this point, I then glue the heel, and I follow it up by matching up the lateral and medial sides, and then hitting the inside of the shoe so I can get a nice bond from my footbed of my upper. Getting these Spizikes re-glued was definitely a lot of hard work, but the glue job actually came out pretty damn good if you ask me. I was able to get some really solid glue lines on these things, but unfortunately there is a tiny bit of a malalignment at the heel. The malalignment is only noticeable if you examine these things extremely closely, but overall the glue job came out nice and clean. After I get these things deep cleaned, it's gonna be time to get a repaint to the midsoles, and we're gonna be just about done with the restoration process.
Before getting these kicks repainted, I wanted to get them looking as crisp and clean as possible, so I gave them a nice deep clean, trying to remove any dirt, scratches, malodor, or grime. After getting these things looking a lot better with a deep clean, it was time to get them repainted. Honestly, I probably could have saved myself a ton of work if I had just repainted these things prior to the reglue, just because of the fact that doing the prep work to get the uppers and the outsoles taped off takes a seriously long amount of time and is very tedious, but so important to the process if you want to make sure that you get a nice crisp line with your repaint. I then tried to fill in some of the pores from the midsole that I got when I was removing the factory paint and tried to sand everything down so I had the smoothest surfaces to work with possible. After getting the kicks completely prepped for their repaint, it was time to lay down my first couple coats of paint. I always like to lay down the first couple coats by hand because I find that this helps to fill in some of the pores and crevices that are created when removing the factory paint. I follow up the first few coats of hand painting by actually utilizing paint from an airbrush to try and give them the nice deep finish that I'm looking for without any sort of brush lines. Then, in order to paint off the red quadrants, I like to tape off the upper and lower half of the midsole to try and make sure that I get as crisp lines as possible. For these red quadrants, I ended up actually hand painting everything because I was finding that I was able to get some nice clean brush strokes, and the colored red paint looked really good when you laid it down in nice, even hand-painted layers. Once I've finished removing the tape that separates the white and red portions of the midsole, I utilize some matte finisher to make sure that I have nice scratch-resistant surfaces. It's then time for the big reveal, and I remove all of the paper towels and tape that were protecting the uppers and the outsoles during the repainting process. This can be a really satisfying part of the process, but you have to make sure that you're extremely careful, otherwise you can peel some of the paint directly off of the midsoles. Finally, it's time to stitch the toe cap of the outsole to the toe cap of the uppers. I begin by pre-poking my holes, and then utilizing some thread and sewing awl, I stitch up the entire toe cap by hand. Once I've finished up the toe cap stitching, it's time to get these kicks laced off and check out the final product. And I gotta say, I think that these things are looking crazy good compared to when I got them.
I have finally finished with the restoration process on this pair of Jordan Spizikes. Even though this was an insanely challenging pair of kicks to restore, I'm really pumped with how they turned out. Through the process of restoring these kicks, I ended up doing a complete reglue, a midsole repaint, and a deep clean. My client decided that he wanted to use the original midsoles on this pair, which made this project quite a bit more difficult due to the fact that this is a 17-year-old pair of kicks. Unfortunately, the midsoles did suffer a little bit of damage during the paint removal process, but I was able to repaint them to get them looking really nice, regardless of any crevices or pores that may have formed during the removal of the factory paint. The reglue went rather smoothly, and I was able to get some nice clean lines. Overall, these things came out insanely clean, especially considering the age and the resulting deterioration of the midsoles. Although these kicks didn't come out 100% perfect due to their age, they're definitely looking a ton nicer and are at least in wearable condition for another couple of years. I'm really curious what you guys think about this restoration though, so please let me know in the comments below if you learned anything during this video. As per usual, thank you to everybody that came through to watch, and I appreciate you all for sticking around until the cold, bitter end. You guys already know, I'm Sailboat, and I'm out of here.